Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing my predicted Sharks lineup to start the season on Wednesday. Now, this video will be instead of a preseason game review of this past game against the Golden Knights. Mostly because of the fact that it is still preseason, it doesn't particularly matter, but also because that game was a bit of a mess all around with all the penalty minutes. The Sharks definitely didn't put their best foot forward in that one. They also lost 5-1. So just all around, not really a game I want to review. And because it's the preseason and we're all tired of the preseason, it feels right to sort of just skip over that for something a bit more regular season focused, which this predicted lineup is. So to start off, for the first line, I suspect Meier, Couture, and Labanc will be together. This is the line that has been together for the last two preseason games. So the two preseason games, the Sharks tried to ice an NHL-ready lineup. And while they haven't looked perfect together, they haven't necessarily gelled yet. I feel like they should come together at some point. They're all three very skilled player, very creative player, and while I don't think it's as well-rounded as maybe if Pavelski were there, now that Pavelski's gone, you sort of have to find a replacement, and Labanc seems to be the best option. I suspect Meier and Couture will remain together for a good chunk of the season. Labanc might get swapped out with somebody else, but the Sharks don't necessarily have much better of an option on the right side unless they make a trade. On the second line, Kane and Hertl as well will likely stay together for a good chunk of the season with a rotating cast on the right wing. Now, I won't mention the fact that, well, I guess I will mention it here, but I won't consider the fact that Evander Kane may in fact be suspended to start the season due to what happened in this past preseason game with his abuse of officials, whether it's 3 games, whether it's 10 games, whether he doesn't get suspended at all. I'm not sure, but for now, I will keep him in the predicted lineups. And on the right side, I have either Radil, Gambrell, or Brodzinski. Now, if it really comes down to it, I do think Lukáš Radil will be the right winger chosen to fill that role in the first game, just because he does have technically the most experience, even if there isn't that much. He's a player who also brings a solid offensive upside to his game. Brodzinski, he was the original front runner, I thought, back at the start of training camp. He actually was doing pretty well, but he sort of fell off. He got this last game against the Golden Knights. He wasn't particularly impressive at all, I'd say. And so I feel like he may be a bit more of a long shot to make it onto the second line. Gambrell is also an option. He is maybe the more defensive option, but I do think Radil's experience in the Sharks lineup will end up winning out in the end, but I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see Gambrell get this second line spot, at least for game 1. For the third line, I suspect Sorensen and Thornton will still be together, as it seems to be for most of the left wings and centermen on this team. That seems to be the duos the Sharks are running with the right wings being swapped out constantly. Sorensen and Thornton were a solid duo this past season, and so this coming season, it should remain the same. And it seems as though Taken has actually managed to win a spot with Joe Thornton. So DeBoer likes to play Thornton with a younger player. He did this last year when he played him with Kevin Labanc. He seems to be doing this again with Taken. Now, it's technically possible Brodzinski could get a spot on that third line, but it would likely be a few games into the season if that were to happen, because it seems as though Taken has won that spot at the moment. He was actually the only Sharks player to get a goal in that Golden Knights game, and it was a pretty nice goal at that. So while he's not necessarily the most well-rounded player, he is quite exciting to watch, and I think there is some potential there, especially for him to work with Thornton on a third line. For the fourth line, this seems to be mostly locked in. Karlsson and Gaudreau as a duo, and then Bergman being that third player there. He has actually looked pretty solid throughout most of training camp, not having a ton of upside, but he does seem to be the most skilled offensively on that fourth line. He adds an interesting dimension in that way to the fourth line. Karlsson and Gaudreau, obviously two pretty defensive players, two penalty kill related, and can bring a bit of offense. Bergman may be able to amplify that somewhat. So this fourth line, while still not necessarily tops in the league, when you take a look again, as I've said multiple times in the past, of the Blues and the Bruins fourth lines in the Stanley Cup Finals last year, it is, I would say, markedly better than it was last season, which is nice to see. Onto the defense, where the pairings are certainly quite fluid, where there are multiple options for these main players. Now, at the moment, Shemek is injured and is unlikely to start in that first game against the Golden Knights, so I would suspect Burns will end up paired with Marc-Edouard Vlasic. This is a pairing that we did see a couple times in the preseason. This is a pairing we saw for the majority of the playoffs last season. It worked out very, very well. And so, especially since they're going up against who's likely their top rival at this point, the Golden Knights, I suspect the Sharks are going to go all out in this first game. So playing Burns and Vlasic together would not surprise me at all. Then in the second pairing, I suspect it would be Karlsson and Dillon. This is the Sharks loading up into their top four. No reason to not do that. On the third pairing, which is where it's a bit more interesting, I suspect Ferraro will get a spot because he is a left-handed defenseman. And then in the other right-handed spot, it will either be Tim Heed or Dalton Prout. Now, neither of these players have actually impressed me really at all during the training camp. They've both actually been quite bad. Heed was at least somewhat better in the game against the Flames. Prout has really shown nothing to me. And Dalton Prout is sort of like the Michael Haley, but on defense. And the issue with that is the fact that you could at least play Michael Haley on the fourth line and give him like 4 minutes in a specific night, and that wasn't too harmful for the team. But Dalton Prout is one of only 6 defensemen in a game, and unless you want to do what the Sharks did in the playoffs with Joakim Ryan and play him like 4 or 5 minutes in a single game, in the regular season you usually want to keep a bit more balance. So Prout in the lineup means he'd likely get at the very least about 10 minutes, which could potentially be harmful with how he actually plays the game. So I'm hoping Tim Heed will get the start with Ferraro, but I could see DeBoer wanting to go with Prout. He's a coach who would, normally plays those types of players, and especially against a team like the Golden Knights, Prout might be able to find his way into the lineup, but I'll have Ferraro and Heed here for now. Once Shemek does return from injury, I suspect Shemek will move up with Burns, and unless DeBoer decides to go back to a Karlsson-Vlasic pairing, which we haven't seen in a long time, Karlsson will likely remain with Dillon, and it'll be Vlasic on the third pairing, who will probably end up with Tim Heed, since Ferraro would have to play on his offside. Now, it might be a bit of a dream to hope that Vlasic and Ferraro end up together and both Heed and Prout end up sitting. I don't know, but that is technically a possibility, but I would guess Vlasic and Heed end up as the main pairing once Shemek does return. In goal, both Jones and Dell are basically locked in. Any of the other goaltenders past Dell didn't really show enough to actually be able to break into this top 2 tandem, and so they will be the goalies manning the fort for the entire season. Martin Jones was mostly good through training camp, but he was not very good in this last game against the Golden Knights. Aaron Dell was also mostly good through training camp. He was okay in filling in against the Golden Knights, although one of the goals wasn't fantastic to let in. But what really the point here is that the Sharks lineup has a lot of fluidity. There is a lot of potential for change on the right wing side for the Sharks forwards. As I said, Radil, Gambrell, Brodzinski. I wouldn't be surprised to see Gambrell in the lineup to start. Brodzinski, a bit of an outside shot, but he could still make it as well for that game 1. So the good news, I guess, would be that whenever you put Radil, Gambrell, Brodzinski, you're taken into the lineup, you know that you're going to get their A game out of them, their 110%, because they're still fighting for a spot, and this isn't a random 4th line spot. This is a 2nd or 3rd line spot, playing with players like Hurdle or Thornton, and potentially getting over a dozen minutes in a night. So these players should definitely be trying their hardest to try and find their way onto the Sharks squad on Wednesday. Class dismissed.